Very good evening to all our viewers. You're with me, DrMaria Zulfikar Khan, and this is The Platform. Tonight on The Platform, we're going to be discussing why it is believed, what motive rather does the US have for providing the non-military aid to Pakistan. Now, it is oftentimes believed that the non-military aid to Pakistan, where anti-American sentiments run rife, is to negate the so-called tyrannical image of the United States in the eyes of a common Pakistani. However, the ground realities paint a picture quite to the contrary. Where is the USAID, the prime aid disbursement agency, faltering in achieving its motive? That is the question we will analyze tonight on The Platform. Joining me today in my Lahore studios is former Finance Minister Mr. Salman Shah, and joining us from Karachi is Express News' business editor Mr. Khurram Hussain. Gentlemen, pleasure to have you here both on my program. Now let's toss over to Washington, where my colleague Raza Naqvi awaits us. Raza, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome viewers to Voice of America's Washington studios. I'm Raza Naqvi. 2 years ago, the U.S. Congress approved the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill, a package of $7.5 billion to be spent in Pakistan for the purposes of developing the country's infrastructure, institutions, and civil society. The authority charged with managing and dispersing this money was the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Today, the USAID program faces criticism both here in the U.S. and in Pakistan, as many say it has been unable to generate goodwill towards the U.S. Yet supporters of the program also point to its many successes. To discuss the USAID program, we are privileged to be joined by Alex Thier, who is the USAID Assistant to the Administrator for the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs. We're also equally privileged to be joined by Steve Inskeep, a popular host with National Public Radio and author of the recent book, Life and Death in Karachi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go over to my co-host, DrMaria Zulfikar, in Islamabad first, and she will ask you guys the first question. Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Raza. Raza, I'd like to ask Mr. Alex as to what is the reason, I mean, this is the million-dollar question here, that what is the reason for this slow disbursement of aid as far as the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill is concerned?
Thanks for the opportunity to be on the show. I just got back from Pakistan on Friday, and I had a great trip and an opportunity. In fact, I saw Mr. Salman Shah in Lahore, and we went to visit one of USAID's projects there, which is a partnership with Nestle, where we're trying to leverage both public funds that we have as well as private funds to help the people of Pakistan. In response to the question, I would essentially combat the premise of your question. I don't think that the disbursements have in any ways been slow. Pakistan is the second largest assistance program, civilian assistance program, that the United States has anywhere in the world. The amount of assistance that has gone to Pakistan since the passage of the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill is quite significant. Over $2 billion of U.S. taxpayer funds have been spent in Pakistan, essentially in the last 2 years. Which is, again, probably as much as we've spent anywhere else in the world, save Afghanistan. And I think that that money is being spent in a way that is meaningful to Pakistan and to Pakistanis. But in order to achieve the objectives that we have with this funding, we don't just spend the money willy-nilly. It's important that the programs that we spend it in are right. It's important that we leverage this money so that others are also coming in. Let me give you a good example of this. We are completing a dam in South Waziristan, of all places, in the Fatah this year. That dam is about 75% paid for by the government of Pakistan and 25% paid for by the American people. The reason that that's important is that, first of all, we're working in a part of the country that's seen very little infrastructure or economic development and is important for the long-term stability and security of Pakistan. It's also important because we've leveraged U.S. taxpayer funds together with Pakistani funds to make this a reality. Right. But we've also done it in a way that benefits the government in a longer term, because that money actually is spent through the government of Pakistan, because our goal is not that people will love America. Sure. Our goal is that people will feel a connection with their own government, sure. And increasingly Pakistan will become more stable as a result.
Sir, I want to ask you this question. You say that $2 billion have been spent, and this is something that Maria was trying to get to, that what was allocated under Kerry Lugar-Berman was $1.5 billion a year. That was the figure we'd heard repeatedly, and it's something that we still hear. That much money simply didn't come through either in 2009, 2010. What is your reasoning for that? Why has that $1.5 billion not been spent per year, and why haven't we not seen that on the ground?
So in 2009, the Congress of the United States allocated about $1 billion in civilian assistance, not $1.5 billion for the people of Pakistan. And that money has been spent in Pakistan. In 2010, they allocated about $1.5 billion, some of which comes to USAID, some of which comes to other civilian agencies, particularly in the State Department, working on rule of law related issues. Of the money that has come to USAID, about half of that, between $600 and $700 million, has been dispersed, and the other money is in projects that are underway. Let me give you an example of a project that I visited last week in Pakistan to explain how the assistance money is actually dispersed. We are building, together with the government of Pakistan, an institute to assist the parliament to be able to do their job in Pakistan. This is like an institution that we have in the United States that essentially does the staff work and research for the parliamentarians so that they can be an effective check on the executive, that they can manage the budget, and that they can manage the security services. In building this institution in Islamabad, you can see a beautiful building going up next to the parliament. That's, of course, a long-term process. So we get these funds and we allocate them towards a project,
right,
but the actual construction of the building takes several years, and we don't pay for the building to be completed until it's completed. We don't pay those bills. So, of course, some of the money that is allocated actually remains with USAID in a partnership
right,
with the Pakistani government until those projects are complete.
So you're saying that this money is not supposed to be spent all at once. These are projects that go over a few years.
Exactly.
I want to go over to Islamabad and get the opinion of Dr. Salman Shah. Now, Dr. Salman Shah, you have the experience of what's going on the ground in Pakistan, and you've been able to look at the USAID program. What is your impression of the program? How would you rate its performance so far? And what would you respond to this criticism that's often leveled that the aid has been slow to be dispersed in Pakistan?
I think that's true because there's a perception that the funds are not coming on time, and this is also mixed up with the military funds, particularly the Coalition Support Fund, which is a separate fund under which military operations are compensated after the expenditure has been done, and those funds have not been coming, and the Ministry of Finance has been borrowing pretty heavily to meet its deficit. So there seems to be a cloud over the entire program, even though the program is being done in a very diligent manner, and we have looked at many projects which are good, and but the problem remains that Ministry of Finance seems to be running out of money all the time, and they think that the CSF funds should have come in. So that's one very major reason for this criticism. The other thing is that I think the perception in Pakistan is that this money is a quid pro quo for taking military action in FATA or some other parts of Pakistan, or you keep hearing that Pakistan is not doing enough, or Pakistan is playing a double game. So that also impacts on the whole thing. The entire the entire kind of atmosphere is affected by politics and also by the program itself, and also it is a very large program which needs to have a very good organization so that it can move very efficiently. And I think they are now getting into handling these projects and getting the feel of these projects, and they are building up the organization to make it work. So Alex was here, and we had a look at one of the projects which we are doing for rural development, and which is an excellent project, but it's being done in the private sector. And the projects which Alex was talking about, the dam being done in the public sector. So there is some confusion on this. What is the role of the public sector and what is the role of the private sector as well? So overall, I think that the teething problems over the last 2 years have been kind of sorted out.
Right.
But if there is a better political atmosphere, I think, and this is what happened when Secretary of State Clinton visited Pakistan, and there seemed to be a reset in the relationship between USA and Pakistan.
Right.
And I think now we may start to move in the same direction, as we may have a better coincidence of
Dr.
interest.
Shah, we have to go over to Karachi, and I'd like to ask Khurram, you heard the figures that were being given by our guests in the United States. I'd like to ask you that when we talk about the figures here in Pakistan, out of the 1.5 billion that was supposedly allocated, our guests are saying the figure is 1 billion, not 1.5 billion. But even out of that 1 billion, it's believed that so far a little over 800 million has been dispersed so far. I'd like to get your comments on that.
Well, you know, more important than the figure right now is the objective that that our guest in Washington DC just outlined. And you know, to me it sounds a little bit odd. It's a little bit strange, because if I understand it correctly, the objective as he just outlined it, the objective that these funds are supposed to accomplish is to promote a connection between the people of Pakistan and the government of Pakistan. Now, this is, if I'm understanding it correctly, this is a very, this might be, you know, a very unique foreign aid program in that sense, because normally foreign aid programs have been construed to pursue objectives such as macroeconomic stability, for instance, in which case the money is usually given to governments in the form of budgetary support and the building up of foreign exchange reserves. Or foreign aid can be given for the purposes of infrastructure support. And then you have the construction of mega dams and power sector projects and mass transit and whatnot. And in both cases, the outcomes that come out of this are seen as being, you know, outcomes that help promote and develop stability. Because if you have a stable macro economy, then it's logical to expect that stability in the country comes from that if you have a functioning infrastructure. But how exactly, you know, $1 billion or $1.5 billion or even $800 million is going to help promote a bond between the people of Pakistan and the government of Pakistan is something that I'm not clear on. I don't quite understand how that sort of a bond will come about as any consequence or result of a foreign aid program. I think that is a bond that will, I think the fact that this objective has been set probably has a lot to do, a great deal to do with the fact that the Kerry-Berman-Lugar Act was drafted in a time period when this particular bond appeared to be taking a lot of strain. It was drafted at a time period when the Pervez Musharraf regime
let me just get the reaction of our guest here in Washington. If we could, thank you for that. We'll just get a quick reaction from our guest here in Washington. Mr. Thier, before we come to you, Steve, I know you've been waiting. Mr. Thier, what's your reaction? You heard some of the fundamental issues that Pakistanis often raise when it comes to the USAID program.
So, of course, what we do and how we do it both contribute to the objectives. Khurram is exactly right. I mean, the fundamental objective of our assistance in building a dam in South Waziristan is to provide critically needed energy to help the economy. It's to provide water to help farmers there. And so those are really critical objectives of the work that we do. As is true in the education sphere, we are working on educating 2 million Pakistani children. We are in the health sphere are immunizing millions of children. And so the critical effects of what we do have an important development impact. But how we do that work is not, as was suggested at the beginning, an attempt to win the hearts and minds of Pakistanis and make them love the United States. The objective is to have those important development impacts, but it's also to have people have more confidence in their government, to have more confidence in their economy. Because at the end of the day, our assistance is a tiny proportion of what Pakistan needs to succeed more broadly. The Secretary of State was just in Pakistan and talked about this theme of trade not aid, which is critical to Pakistanis. And the real message there is that the Pakistani economy, the crisis with energy, is going to be resolved by Pakistanis. It's going to be resolved by private investment. It's going to be resolved by better governance. It's not going to be resolved by aid programs. What we can do is to facilitate that.
Right. Steve, I want to get your perspective on this. You were recently in Pakistan. You've done a bit of reporting there, and you've seen on the ground what is going on, and you provide a unique perspective in that sense. From your perspective, when you were in Pakistan, how aware were you of the U.S. aid program? How aware of you of U.S. assistance in Pakistan? What did you see in that regard?
On some of my reporting trips, I've gone looking for it, but even when you don't go looking for it, you do hear about it. A central event in the book that I wrote is bombing in Karachi, followed by the burning of hundreds of shops in 2009. If I'm not mistaken, U.S. assistance, including U.S. aid money, was used to rebuild some of the shops. So the money is there. It comes into the conversation. But I've been really interested listening to everyone, all the voices here today, because there does seem to be a conflict between ends and means and between different goals. Senator Richard Lugar, one of the men who has his name on the Kerry-Lugar bill, spoke to us not long ago about his objective of making sure that whoever is in charge in Pakistan, that we have friends there. That's the long-term goal. But it is a long-term goal as people see it. And we're in a situation where Americans expect short-term results. We're in the middle of a war and people want things now. And when Americans get frustrated about Pakistan's performance in that war, people will raise the money and say, we've given them all these billions, why don't we get anything for it? On the Pakistani side, I think there's also some confusion. When I've been there this year speaking with USAID people and asking them about questions and concerns about where's the money going, why is it not going more quickly, I get examples like this one from southern Punjab, where, if I'm not mistaken, there is an effort to build schools, but there was an effort to work through local and provincial authorities to do that, to build capacity, as the U.S. officials would say it, so that the schools can be built by Pakistanis rather than bringing in some giant American contractor. I mean, you could bring in Halliburton, as we did in Iraq, but that doesn't always work, and it doesn't always seem very cost effective. The capacity building, though, is slow. And the other thing that was happening when I was there in May and June was Osama bin Laden had just been killed, and the provincial government of Punjab, as your guests in Pakistan will know very well, made announcements that they were going to start doing without American aid. I think there is some confusion on the American side as to what the aid is about. I would agree with that. I think there's some confusion on the Pakistani side, in which people resent feeling that they are a client state of the United States, but at the same time would like to see the aid if they can get it in favorable terms.
Right, it's an interesting point, and before we go back to Islamabad, Mr. Thier, I want to get you to chime in on this as well. I mean, you say that the aid is for the development of Pakistan, is for the sake of trying to build institutions there, but there is an important symbolic aspect to this aid, and Steve spoke to this very eloquently, saying that both here in the United States it's seen as a tool of trying to build goodwill in Pakistan, and Pakistan it's seen as sort of something to resent, as a bribery almost mechanism for Pakistan. Why has the United States aid program not been able to develop the goodwill that many here in the U.S. Congress have said it needs to? And what are some of the roadblocks we face in trying to achieve that objective? In fact, I'll ask you this. As a USAID official, is that an objective that you keep in mind?
Well, I think it's really critical, as Steve just outlined, to look at the context, particularly of the last 9 months. Last fall, the United States was by far the largest donor and responder to the devastating floods that hit Pakistan. And I think that there was a widespread recognition that assistance was significant in scale, it was timely, and that it really helped some of the worst parts of the crises. After that, the incidents from January and May and through this summer, we have been operating, frankly, in a very difficult difficult political climate. I think that the important point to make, and President Obama said this himself a few weeks ago, is that even as we have political challenges in dealing with Pakistan, even as we have security challenges in dealing with Pakistan, what we recognize is the importance, the critical importance of a long-term people-to-people civilian relationship with Pakistan. As somebody who works for USAID and someone who's been working in and around Pakistan for 18 years, it is absolutely critical that the United States remains engaged in Pakistan, that we remain engaged in the process of democratic consolidation, that the next election and the election after that are really the long-term goals for reestablishing democratic and civilian control in Pakistan. And frankly, that requires a long-term relationship. So even as Dr. Salman Shah mentioned, the security assistance has been challenged. We have continued the civilian assistance because we think that is critical, despite, frankly, the very difficult political environment that we've been operating in.
Right. Maria, I want to come back over to you in Pakistan and get your guests to react to what has been said here in Washington about the USAID program. I mean, obviously there's pull and push both directions. How do our guests in Pakistan see that?
Dr. Shah, I'd like to pick up on the point that one of our guests in Washington, Mr. Steve, made, that there's some kind of a confusion as far as what the real objective behind this aid is. I mean, it is our understanding here in Pakistan that the United States wants to win the hearts and minds of the Pakistani people and, of course, create a positive sentiment as far as the United States is concerned. Could you comment on that?
I think one of the reasons is that when the US goes to the NGO sector, the public sector gets annoyed and they think that 1.5 billion should have been coming to the budget.
Is the amount 1.5 billion? I'd like to clarify that as well.
The bill says 1.5 billion,
that's
but
right.
over a 5-year period it's 7.5
right.
billion. And probably the government thinks that it should do all the, it should receive all the money and dispense it through its public sector development programs or meet its budgetary obligations. And the missing link over here really is the private sector, because neither is the private sector on the US side nor the private sector on Pakistani side are really involved in interaction. So even though the project which Alex just mentioned, Nestle is one partner over there, but we also need a US partner in the private sector. If we look at Afghanistan and Pakistan's economic relationship, Pakistan is exporting about $2 billion worth of goods and services to Afghanistan, but we are not getting anything back from Afghanistan because they are not producing anything which we could buy. But in terms of minerals, they can be a huge kind of relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and USA seems to be kind of disconnected from that. So if we see the recent auction of iron ore mines in Afghanistan, there were Indian companies and there were some local companies, but no US or Western companies in conjunction with Pakistan, because Pakistan is the most appropriate place to have that kind of linkage with Afghanistan. So I think that when Secretary of State talked about the Silk Road initiative and she talked about trade and not aid, I think these are the initiatives. When they are operationalized, then you can see that this will no longer be a client-state kind of relationship. It will really be an economic relationship, and in which I think the private sectors of both countries could be involved. And for example, we are looking at an idea where the CEOs of some very major Pakistani companies and CEOs of US companies should have a forum where they can talk about economic initiatives and economic benefits. And really, when we shift from aid to trade, that's a very major shift, and I think USAID program should dovetail into that, because ultimately if there is a strategic partnership with the US, it has to be an economic strategic partnership, and that can be a sustainable partnership. I mean, education and health and livelihoods are very, very important, but if you are going to fundamentally change the relationship, it's the trade relationship, and it's It's like if we are going to go into Central Asia, if we are going to open up Afghanistan, then I think Pakistan and the Western economies, particularly the US economy, have to do it jointly. Right now, if you look at Afghanistan, it's either China or it's India which is moving in, and the Western countries are not involved. And Pakistan is certainly not involved. So that's the strategic joining up which we need to do to be able to come and do this thing very well. Now there's also a perception that US is promoting India over there. But I think we need not worry about that. We need to look at how we can be a part of that relationship.
Right. Raza, I believe you want to ask something.
Maria, I was just going to try and get the perspective of Steve here. We've been waiting patiently. Steve, how would you respond to what Mr. Salman Shah was saying?
I was very interested in it, and if you'll indulge me, I wonder if there's just a bit of American government explaining that might be worth doing, because we've heard $1.5 billion per year, and Mr. Thier has also said $1 billion per year. If I'm not mistaken, this is money the United States Congress voted on once, but then under American rules, they actually vote on it again, and they may approve a little less than they approved the first time. And I followed Pakistani politics enough to know that our Pakistani viewers will understand that sometimes politicians do confusing things and change their minds about things. Now, the other point that I thought was really outstanding was the point about trade. I'm really interested in that. You have in Pakistan one of the largest countries in the world, and it's continuing to grow. That creates grave problems, but also great opportunities. You also have a country that, although it's often described as being in a tough neighborhood, is next door to one of the world's largest nations and one of the world's great rising economies in India. When I travel to Pakistan, when I talk to Pakistanis, there's so much curiosity about India. There's interest in traveling to India. I know there's been talk in recent days about a multi-billion-dollar trade deal with India, and I'm curious, given the insights of the Pakistani guests, who surely have greater insight than I, what they think about the possibilities there. Could a different relationship with India, I'm asking the question, not advocating, could a different relationship with India spark a lot of the economic growth that you're looking for?
That's an interesting question, and I think it was something we'll get to very soon in the show. I want to ask our guest in Karachi, Mr. Hussain. Mr. Hussain, now, from your perspective, I mean, we've heard issues of the private sector not being as involved in the aid process. We also heard this question of trade, not aid. From your perspective, what is Pakistan's basic development need right now? I mean, if you really get down to it, what does Pakistan need primarily, and do you think that's being delivered by either the government in Pakistan or the USAID program over here?
Well, I think whatever the biggest development need is must come from the Pakistani government itself. There has got to be very strong domestic Pakistani ownership of Pakistani priorities and the Pakistani development agenda. That's absolutely critical. But if you ask me to rank order the developmental needs of the country, it's very easy for me to say that that the energy crisis and the power crisis that the country is currently in the middle of, that is projected to get a lot more intense, a lot worse, with the passage of the years because of the declining gas reserves in the country. This presents very urgent challenges at this point in time. And the longer the difficult decisions regarding fuel and fuel choice in the power sector, the longer these decisions are delayed, the nature of the crisis grows. The power crisis begins as a crisis in the deficit between supply and demand of electricity, but it also then becomes a fiscal crisis because of the need to sustain heavy subsidies. It becomes a crisis in the reserves or in your trade statistics because of the heavy need to import oil, which is the largest import item in Pakistan. In Pakistan's external trade. It's a crisis that has so many dimensions to it that I think it's probably the biggest, most growing and urgent challenge. And I want to just very quickly throw my voice 100% behind the Pakistan-India trade initiative. Pakistan cannot expect to grow beyond very far beyond where it already is if it remains cut off, and if we voluntarily cut off ourselves and our economy from one of the world's largest and fastest growing economies, which happens to be right next door to us. And I find it somewhat absurd sometimes when I see Pakistani policymakers going to the EU, going to America, and asking for trade or access to the markets in the EU and the US, while at the same time we've cut ourselves off from one of the largest, most lucrative and most natural markets for Pakistani output right here, right next to us in our neighborhood.
Sure.
That's something.
Those are two interesting points, Mr. Hussain. We have to now go for a short break, but when we get back, we will continue talking about the USAID strategy in Pakistan and where it can help in Pakistan. Stay with us.
Welcome back. After the break, you're watching The Platform. Let's cross over to Washington now. Raza, I'd like to ask Mr. Alex about another perception here in Pakistan, which is that, the United States is oftentimes criticized that they make tall claims and they do not necessarily always come through. As far as I'd like to quote the example of the ROZs, the Reconstruction Opportunity Zones, which were promised in the tribal areas, which never came through. I'd like to hear from him as to why that promise has not been fulfilled as of yet.
Yeah, I mean, this, Mr. Thier, this speaks to that question of trade, not aid, and it's something that Dr. Salman Shah brought up, and it's something that we hear from Pakistanis, and in fact, a fair few Americans as well, that trade is a better strategy. Now, I know USAID is obviously the development agency. You guys are doing the development work, but is there some sort of emphasis on trying to build a better trade relationship with Pakistan, particularly with issues such as the ROZs, which have been on the plate for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. To the narrow issue of the ROZs, and as your listeners or viewers also understand, we have repeatedly requested of the Congress to provide this legislation. We think it's very important, and it hasn't passed. The same is true. We want to create an enterprise fund for Pakistan, which is a vehicle that uses American taxpayer dollars to invest in small and medium enterprises, something that was fantastically successful in Eastern Europe. People may know about that. We're hoping that the Congress will pass that as well. But we're not always in control of whether those things move forward. But on the broader question of trade, I first flew to Pakistan in 1993, and at the time, people were so excited by the promise of the collapse of the Soviet Union and essentially the potential to reopen the trade relationship between South Asia and Europe and the Middle East and, of course, Central Asia on the path through. And it is time that we fulfill this promise nearly 20 years later. It hasn't happened. It will revolutionize the economies of the region. South Asia and Central Asia are probably the least integrated economy in the entire world in terms of contiguous
Silk Road initiative.
And it will have effects that we can't even describe, and certainly a lot of those effects are not things that the Pakistani government or the American government will do. It will be entrepreneurs from the region who will open that up, but we have to create the space for them to do that. Narrowly, last year we were very intensively engaged with Afghanistan and Pakistan to come up with the new Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement. This will greatly increase the transit trade between the two countries and hopefully open up more broadly to the neighboring states, but it needs to be implemented. And one of the many challenges that we face across the board in these sorts of programs is governance. Right. It's one thing for people to want it, it's another thing for people to want it and us to find the resources, but then it's a third thing for the governments, particularly in the area, to make it happen. They have to change their regulations. They actually have to make it possible for people for it to be economically for people to trade across these
Steve,
borders.
I want to ask you about this issue of trade as well, because this is an issue that seems, when we talk about it here in Washington, it's something that's hung up in Congress. Just give us a sense for our viewers what that issue is in Congress, why Pakistan has not been able to see a further opening of the trade relationship with the United States, especially since, as Alex says, a lot of people are advocating for that.
Well, this is something I've not reported on in detail, but I do know that opening up trade with the United States is always a politically fraught issue. The U.S. struggled for years to get trade agreements in recent months with countries like Colombia and South Korea, where the relationship would seem to be less fraught than it is with Pakistan. And so it's a very difficult time. It's a very difficult time to get anything through the United States Congress that requires any kind of debate, especially partisan debate. So it's a difficult time for that. It may be easier for you to open up trade with India than to open up trade further with the United States. I may be overstating it slightly, but not a lot. Not a lot.
That's interesting. I mean, before we go back to Pakistan, Alex, I want to get you to address something that was being said before the break. Mr. Hussain brought this up, that one of the major priorities people everywhere in Pakistan talk about for the country is this issue of energy. Now, I want to ask you directly, what is the USAID doing in order to address the energy needs of Pakistan?
Energy is also our top priority in Pakistan, and that's not by mistake. It's through consultations with the government and the people. Clearly, there's a crisis that needs to be addressed, and we're really doing two things. The first is that we're helping to build capacity. USAID, by the end of 2012, will add about 500 megawatts to the grid in Pakistan. We're adding new capacity. We also have programs, another great public-private sector partnership in Baluchistan, where we're trading out tube well pumps that are enormously more energy efficient, and so we're also helping Pakistanis to save energy. But the bigger picture here is really that Pakistan's energy sector needs better governance. There needs to be reform. There needs to be reform in the tariff structure. People need to pay their bills. If energy is going to be viable in the long term in Pakistan, some of these rules and regulations need to change. And we are working intensively with the government of Pakistan, with the power distribution companies, to try to reform on the policy side, because that's really where the big difference is going to be made.
Before we go back to Pakistan, I just want to ask you this, because it's an issue that a lot of people talk about, the Basha Dam. It's something that we've heard a lot about, but you know, it was, well, the groundbreaking ceremony was completed recently, but there is still a question of whether or not the money is going to go through. What's the USAID position on the Basha Dam? Are we getting is Pakistan going to get the money for that, or and what are the roadblocks there?
I just met with senior Pakistani government officials, including the chairman of WAPTA, last week to talk about the Basha Dam. We are partnering with the Asian Development Bank to do a feasibility assessment of the dam. That means technically, is it feasible? Is it environmentally sound? What happens to the people who will be displaced from that? And is it economically sound? Is there a plan in place to finance this enormous dam? It could have tremendous benefits for Pakistan economically and in terms of energy, and we are heavily engaged with the government right now, trying to figure out if this is going to be a viable project.
We've heard the World Bank is also a bit of an issue here, because it has to receive certification from India to try and get that to go through.
I'll let the World Bank respond to that. Thus far, we are working, again, with the government and with the Asian Development Bank across the board to make sure that this is going to be a viable project.
Maria, I want to come back over to you and get your guests to talk about this issue a little bit more, and also get to this question of what are some of the issues, Alex referred to, some of the governance issues in Pakistan that might also inhibit the USAID program from fully realizing its potential. What are some of the issues that they see from the Pakistani end that are being roadblocks?
Dr. Saab, what we've seen here in Pakistan is that when the KLB came out and transparency was required as far as the aid is concerned, there was a lot of hue and cry. Our politicians were screaming that this is unfair, this is unjustified. What is your stance on that? Shouldn't we be glad to provide transparency as to where this money is going?
Absolutely, there is no doubt about that, because if you look at the Pakistan government budget, it is close to 40 billion US dollars, and Kerry Lugar bill, if you look at it, it's 1.5 billion, but disbursement is, let's say, 1 billion. So, I mean, from our own perspective, we must make sure that the 40 billion which we are spending in the budget is being done in a transparent fashion. So one of the, I think, weaknesses of the USAID program is that instead of tackling the issue of transparency in government, they kind of avoided it and said, okay, let's try to distribute the aid through the NGOs or some mechanism by which they can ring fence the project, and so they can understand where the money went. Now that's fine, but if we could have looked at the Auditor General's function in Pakistan, and then we had looked at the budgeting system in Pakistan, and if we could have said, okay, Pakistan, you need to reform your budgeting system, and which means that you may go to a more modern form of budgeting, program budgeting, or put in a review where you can see what happened to your money and did you get your money's worth or not. So I think those issues, which are very fundamental issues and which go to the governance in Pakistan, maybe wisely they avoided getting into it and said, if we try to reform the budgeting system, maybe it will take us ages before we can get anything done. But I think that was one of the weaknesses. We should have gone in to improve our budgeting and performance evaluation and accountability to the parliament, made more information available. So I think that was one of the issues, and which for our own survival we have to make sure that we really tackle these issues and we spend the money, whether it's our own taxpayers' money or anybody else's money, we spend it wisely. Now I think in this on the Bhasha Dam also, if we look at it, it's a project, you can very easily fence it and you can say, okay, this is a good project or a bad project, which depends on the evaluation of it, and that could be a very symbolic kind of a project, because USAID, whereas they are doing training the people or making the schools, but if you make a symbolic project like we had the Mangla Dam or the Tarbela Dam, people can relate to it. And so there is a bit of a pride in doing these mega kind of projects. And one thing I would like to also say, that when the US talks about India, Pakistanis kind of feel that this is a sinister move to make India hegemonic over this whole region, and therefore there is a kind of a resentment that why is the US saying to us, be friendly with the Indians and develop, you can do this and do that. But our experience in the last 5 years of opening up trade with India has been that there are so many non-tariff barriers in India that lots of our industry, which had a competitive advantage, has not been able to get into India. And hopefully if we can create some results, then things can start to move. So even when we talk to India or talk to China or Afghanistan or the greater region, results have to come through.
Let's go over to Karachi, and I'd like to ask Khurram. Dr. Shah just pointed out, and he said that perhaps the United States should have ensured transparency through the government, not through these non-governmental organizations. Do you believe that that is the case, and that would have perhaps generated different results?
Well, Maria, look, wherever public money is concerned, transparency is always a good thing. That's my belief. That if you're dealing with money that belongs to the public at large, then you should deal with it in such a way that the public at large can see how and where the money is going. But more so than transparency, what's important here is that that USAID is perceived in Pakistan as a project that is hemmed in by geopolitics. Right. It's certainly, it can be argued very certainly that it's a project motivated by very noble intentions. But at the end of the day, politics and geopolitics and priorities coming out of the war on terror seem to trump all other priorities. For instance, and I'll give you an example here in the energy sector. Now, it's very true that Pakistan, that central to the energy sector's problems are governance issues, particularly to do with technical losses and to do with theft of electricity. A lot of the electricity that is generated and sent out into the system does not come back in the form of revenue, in the form of money paid for it. And the losses range anywhere from reportedly 10% in the ISCO area to up to 35, perhaps even larger percentage in distribution areas like Sindh or Karachi, which are very large losses. But there is another problem here, which is very, very critical and very important to understand, which is that Pakistan's deteriorating fuel mix. We are relying increasingly with the passage of the years on imported fuel, imported oil to generate electricity with. And that's the most expensive electricity that we can get.
We have to... we have to toss over to Washington. We have to toss over to Washington because they do have very limited time. Let's cross over to Washington. Raza, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Alex, a few points that were raised in Pakistan. One is this issue of where this money is going, who it's going through, the government or the NGO sector. How do you determine where this money goes? How does the USAID look at that problem?
Let me say, first of all, I agree very strongly with our friends in Pakistan, and transparency is absolutely fundamental. It's fundamental for us as American citizens to see where our money going, and it's fundamental for Pakistanis. We've done two interesting things this year, I think, to increase transparency. We've actually funded Transparency International to set up a hotline about assistance programs to make sure that all possible anti-fraud measures are in place. We are also funding the Auditor General of Pakistan, which was mentioned. We've also greatly increased the amount of information that's available to viewers, and I would encourage them to go to our website to see where we explain, I think in fairly straightforward fashion, much better than what we had before, about where those aid dollars are going. Because even in an hour's time, we're never going to be able to cover that. We made a policy decision, the United States government, that essentially our money is going to go to two places. About half of our funding is going to go through Pakistani institutions, principally the Pakistani government, and the other half goes to non-governmental implementing partners. We think that it's a critical mixture to be able to reach the people, to be able to build capacity, to fund civil society, but at the same time to make the Pakistani government more competent. But I do encourage people to look at that allocation to make sure that they see where the money is going, and that they see that it's fair.
Steve, I want to get your perspective. Again, you were there in Pakistan. I want to go back to this issue of how this aid is perceived, because this seems to be the most critical thing about this. I mean, you can talk about the nitty-gritty. When you were in Pakistan, how did you see the way in which this aid is perceived, particularly the civilian aid effort? I mean, the military aid aside, but the civilian aid effort. Do you think it was able to generate any sort of traction there?
There's a degree of traction. I mean, people look around and see what the money has done. I spent money over the summer, or spent time over the summer, I should say, at Foreman Christian College in Lahore, where you can look up and there's a building that was paid for with USAID money. And the students on that campus were aware of that fact. At the same time, they felt in some ways that it was a buyout, that they were being bought. And that was something that some students had arrived at themselves, and it was a conclusion that others had clearly heard in the media. There is a pretty harsh conversation in the media in Pakistan right now that would be hard for anyone, however well-intentioned, to overcome, I would think. I think there are also facts that simply work against this aid being perceived well. Mr. Thier has mentioned that their top priority is improving the power sector. That has got to be the one thing that most bothers Pakistanis. But however much they are improving it right now, the power is still off for hours and hours every single day in every part of Pakistan. They are so far from a solution there that any money that gets sent in that direction is going to seem like it disappeared for a while, whether it is or not. You have a fundamental problem in the way that resources are allocated. The gentleman who said that perhaps 35 to 40% of the electricity isn't paid for in Sindh. Having spent time in Karachi, I was impressed it was only that low. There are vast amounts of the economy, and Pakistanis know this well, that are informal. They are beyond the rule of law. There are vast neighborhoods that don't have formal government services, that have to steal electricity if they're going to get some. And there are vast areas of the major cities where the writ of the government doesn't really extend. That phrase, the writ of the government, is often used in reference to FATA, but I think it also applies to some urban areas of Pakistan.
So there are many challenges that we face, and one of the, obviously, the big challenges that this USAID program is often seen in the context of the broader conflict in that region. Unfortunately, we have run out of time here in Washington. I want to thank both our guests for joining us here in our studios, and thank both our guests in Pakistan also for joining us. Maria, I'm going to leave it to you to close off the show, but from here in Washington, it's good night for now.
Thank you, Raza. Now, Dr. Shah, final word from you. Clearly, the US, I mean, you are working with the USAID projects, so you do know that they are doing a lot. Clearly, they are doing a lot. But how do we translate it and how do we explain to our people? That seems to be the confusion here, and that seems to be the dichotomy.
I think the program which Alex was talking about, we trained a few people in veterinary services, and I could see that for the first time somebody has done something for them, and these are people from the rural areas, and they'll take their certificates and they'll go home and put it on their wall and do some servicing over there, and I'm positive that it will have a very important effect over there, that yes, this was something useful for their lives and they will continue. So I don't think you are going to get laurels immediately. It's a long-term thing. We should gradually be looking at how do we integrate Pakistan economy globally. Right. And I would say that if we could get some trade, not aid kind of initiatives in place, and the key is the US market, because unless we are connected with the US market, we will not be seen to be a strategic partner. Right. Everything otherwise it looks like a tactical relationship. Right. So I think we have to have that strategic partnership, and that is ultimately a free trade agreement with the US.
Dr. Shah, thank you for being on this program, and I'd like to thank Khurram Hussain, who joined us from Karachi as well. Thank you, Khurram, for being on this program. And I'd like to end this program on what Dr. Shah said, that it's a long-term process and you won't get laurels immediately, and the way forward is perhaps through trade and not aid. That is what Pakistan has been asking for. That is what Pakistan has been demanding for quite some time now. On that note, DrMaria Zulfikar Khan signing out for tonight. Good night and Allah Hafiz.